South Vietnam. The rain had ended just before dawn, leaving the airfield wrapped in steam and the smell of wet earth. The jungle pressed in from every side, thick and patient, as if it were slowly reclaiming the strip of concrete carved into it by men and machines. At the far end of the runway, beneath camouflage netting and armed guards, stood an aircraft that was never meant to be there. A MiG-17 Fresco. Captain Jonathan Reed stopped several meters away and simply looked at it. He had seen enemy aircraft destroyed in midair, shattered on impact, burned into wreckage barely recognizable as machines. But this one was whole, intact. Its dull aluminum skin bore scorch marks and faded red stars, hastily overpainted but not erased. It looked tired, used, real. "This jet flew combat yesterday," the intelligence officer said quietly. "Against our boys." The MiG had not been shot down. It had landed. A North Vietnamese pilot had defected, flown south at treetop level, dodging radar and patrols, and touched down on an auxiliary strip before anyone fully understood what was happening. By nightfall, the pilot was gone, and the aircraft was already being stripped, photographed, measured, and guarded like a dangerous animal. Reed had flown over 100 combat missions in the F-4 Phantom II. He trusted its engines, its radar, its missiles. He trusted the philosophy behind it. Detect first, shoot first, kill from beyond sight. And yet, standing in front of the MiG-17, he felt none of that confidence. The aircraft looked obsolete. Straight wings, nose intake, no radar worth mentioning. A gunfighter in an age of missiles. Next to the Phantom parked farther down the strip, it looked like a relic pulled from a museum. One of the crew chiefs shook his head. "Hard to believe this thing's giving us trouble." Reed didn't answer. He had read the debriefs. Phantom crews jumped at low altitude, missiles failing to track, engagements collapsing into tight, brutal turning fights where speed and electronics meant little. Gun cameras showing enemy aircraft so close they filled the frame. The MiG-17 was not supposed to survive in modern air combat. Yet it did. Inside the cockpit, Reed felt like he had stepped backward in time. The instruments were basic, large, mechanical. No radar display. No missile management systems. The gun sight was simple but clear. Switches were solid, almost crude, designed to be flipped hard, not delicately managed. There was no comfort here. No allowance for fatigue. The seat was stiff. The canopy distorted the edges of the world. Everything about the cockpit suggested one thing. The pilot was expected to endure. The translated flight manual was thin and direct. No tactical theory. No philosophy. Just procedure. Start. Climb. Intercept. Fire. Land if fuel allows. The MiG-17 was not designed to patrol. It was designed to react. That night, Reed lay in his bunk listening to the distant thud of artillery and the constant noise of insects. He thought about the difference between how wars were planned and how they were actually fought. American doctrine assumed clarity, clear radar pictures, controlled engagements, carefully managed airspace. Vietnam offered none of that. Clouds appeared without warning. Terrain forced aircraft low. Rules of engagement delayed missile shots. The enemy chose when and where to fight and disappeared into the jungle when they were done. The MiG-17 did not need perfect conditions. It expected imperfect ones. 2 days later, Reed was cleared to fly it. The engine start was violent and uneven. The aircraft shook as if protesting its captivity. Taxiing felt awkward, visibility poor, brakes weak. Everything about the MiG seemed to resist refinement. Then it lifted off. Acceleration was modest compared to the Phantom, but once airborne, the MiG felt balanced. Honest. The controls were heavy but precise. There was no lag, no delay between thought and motion. At low altitude, weaving above rivers and green canopy, Reed felt something unsettling. The MiG belonged here, where the Phantom felt like a high-altitude predator forced down into a knife fight. The MiG was a brawler. It turned tightly. It responded instantly. It punished indecision but rewarded commitment. Reed imagined a fight at 2,000 feet. Clouds closing. Missiles useless. Speed bleeding away. He knew which aircraft he would rather face in that moment. "This aircraft isn't trying to be the best," he said into the recorder. "It's trying to survive long enough to kill something." As he brought the MiG back toward the hidden strip, sweat soaked through his flight suit. Landing was unforgiving. Too fast, and it floated. Too slow, and it dropped hard. The MiG demanded respect all the way to the ground. When the wheels finally touched, Reed exhaled slowly. He climbed out and looked back at the aircraft, its engine ticking as it cooled, its skin streaked with oil and rain. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, Reed felt he understood the enemy a little better. They were not trying to outthink America. They were trying to outlast it. And the MiG-17 was built for exactly that kind of war. Captain Jonathan Reed spent the next 2 weeks flying the MiG-17 whenever weather, fuel, and politics allowed. Each sortie stripped away another assumption he had carried into Vietnam. On paper, the MiG was inferior in almost every measurable category. It was slower in level flight. It climbed worse than the Phantom at altitude. Its engine smoked badly, and its fuel endurance was laughable. Any comparison chart favored American aircraft decisively. And yet, every time Reed brought the MiG back down through the clouds and into the humid chaos below 10,000 feet, the numbers stopped matching. The MiG thrived where the Phantom struggled. At low altitude, the MiG-17 was stable, forgiving, and brutally predictable. Its straight wings generated lift at speeds that would make the Phantom shudder. The aircraft could turn hard without bleeding control authority. It responded instantly, without the delay imposed by hydraulic dampers and complex control systems. Reed began simulating combat profiles based on real engagement reports. Sudden visual contact, no missile lock, high closure rates, sharp turns at treetop level. In those conditions, the MiG did not feel outdated. It felt prepared. The Phantom, by contrast, was designed around assumptions that Vietnam consistently violated. Clear radar pictures, long-range missile shots, time to assess and decide. Below the clouds, those advantages evaporated. The aircraft became heavy, fast, and unforgiving. A mistake at low altitude meant little room to recover. Reed recorded his impressions meticulously. The MiG-17 accepts chaos, he dictated after one flight. The Phantom attempts to control it. That distinction haunted him. Maintenance crews were equally surprised. The MiG required little attention. Panels came off easily. Systems were accessible. Damage tolerance was built into the airframe. Where the Phantom demanded specialists and spare parts flown halfway across the world, the MiG seemed content with basic tools and improvisation. One crew chief summed it up bluntly. This thing's made to be fixed by tired men in bad conditions. Reed compiled his findings into a report intended for Air Force Tactical Command. It was not long, but it was direct. He did not praise Soviet engineering. He did not claim the MiG was superior. Instead, he focused on philosophy. The MiG-17 is optimized for the war as it exists in Southeast Asia, he wrote. Not for theoretical combat, but for weather, terrain, rules of engagement, and pilot fatigue. He argued that American aircraft were suffering not from technical inferiority, but from doctrinal mismatch. They were built to fight a different kind of war. When Reed briefed the report, the room was tense. A senior officer flipped through the pages, jaw tight. "So what are you suggesting, Captain? That we abandon our technological edge?" Reed shook his head. "No, sir. I'm suggesting we stop assuming it will always matter." Silence followed. Another officer spoke carefully. "The MiG can't win air superiority. It can't project power." "No," Reed replied. "But it doesn't need to. It only needs to deny us comfort." That was the moment the briefing shifted. The report did not challenge performance metrics. It challenged identity. American air power was built on the belief that technology could impose order on war. Reed was suggesting that the enemy had built a machine that thrived on disorder instead. The report was classified, distributed narrowly, and quietly set aside. Officially, its conclusions were context-specific. Unofficially, it made people uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the war continued to provide evidence. Over North Vietnam, MiG-17s kept appearing in conditions where they should not have survived. They attacked when clouds were low. They forced fights at speeds and altitudes that neutralized American advantages. They escaped into terrain where radar and missiles were useless. Phantom crews began adapting. Gun pods were added. Training emphasized visual combat again. The technology bent slowly toward reality. Reed watched these changes with a sense of grim validation. He received combat reports describing engagements almost identical to the scenarios he had simulated. Close-range fights, missed missiles, Gun kills decided in seconds. The MiG-17 was not dominating the sky. It was shaping it. By forcing American pilots to fight on its terms, it imposed cost, stress, and uncertainty. It made every sortie harder, every victory less clean. One evening, Reed sat alone in the operations hut, reading casualty lists. Names he recognized. Men who had trusted their machines as much as he once had. He realized then that the MiG's greatest weapon was not its guns or its turning ability. It was psychological. It denied the illusion of control. In a war already defined by uncertainty, that denial mattered more than speed or altitude. Reed added a final note to his personal journal that never made it into any official report. In Vietnam, victory does not belong to the side with the best aircraft. It belongs to the side whose aircraft best matches the nature of the war. The MiG-17 does not try to win quickly. It tries to remain relevant longer than we expect. And that may be enough. The jungle outside the airstrip remained unchanged. The weather continued to ignore forecasts. The war went on. And somewhere above the clouds, small, simple fighters kept forcing a superpower to fight on uncomfortable terms. By late 1969, Captain Jonathan Reed no longer flew combat missions. Officially, his experience was better utilized elsewhere. Unofficially, his conclusions had made him inconvenient. The war, however, did not care about convenience. Over North Vietnam, the pattern repeated itself with stubborn consistency. American aircraft arrived in overwhelming force, guided by the most advanced systems ever assembled. They struck targets with precision measured in meters. And still, MiG-17s and MiG-21s continued to rise from battered runways, engage briefly, and disappear. They did not challenge dominance. They challenged endurance. Reed followed the air war through classified reports and pilot debriefs. Each document echoed the same themes he had written months earlier. Low-altitude ambushes, visual engagements, missiles rendered useless by clouds, heat, or rules of engagement. Dogfights decided in seconds, not minutes. The enemy never stayed long. They didn't need to. Their objective was not to win the sky, but to make the sky hostile. American pilots adapted. Gun pods became common. Training syllabi changed. The Air Force quietly reintroduced dogfighting doctrine it had declared obsolete only years earlier. Technology did not disappear, but it was forced to bend. Reed recognized this as reluctant validation. In 1970, he was invited to contribute to an internal tactical review titled Lessons from Southeast Asia. His section was brief and carefully worded. The enemy's aircraft should not be evaluated solely on performance metrics, he wrote. They must be evaluated on their compatibility with environment, logistics, pilot training, and the psychological conditions of sustained conflict. He stopped short of calling Soviet design superior. He didn't need to. The war itself was making the argument. North Vietnamese aircraft losses were heavy, but replaceable. Their pilots flew short sorties, guided from the ground, operating close to home. Maintenance was simple. Expectations were modest. American aircraft were extraordinary, but demanded perfection to remain so. Every advanced system increased dependency. Every layer of sophistication added fragility. When conditions were ideal, American airpower was unmatched. When conditions degraded, as they inevitably did, the advantage narrowed. Reed wrote privately, "We built machines to impose order. They built machines to survive disorder." In 1972, during Operation Linebacker II, the lesson reached its sharpest expression. B-52s thundered toward Hanoi under escort, representing the peak of American industrial and technological might. Yet even then, MiGs continued to rise, challenge, distract, and harass. They were not winning, but they were still flying. Reed watched footage of damaged North Vietnamese airfields, cratered runways hastily patched, aircraft operating from strips that would have grounded most Western jets. He recognized the philosophy instantly. These machines were not designed to prevent failure. They were designed to function after it. When the war finally wound down, Reed retired quietly. No ceremony, no public acknowledgement of his work. His reports remained classified, referenced occasionally, never celebrated. Years later, in the late 1970s, he stood in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, staring at a MiG-17 displayed beneath bright lights. Visitors passed it without much interest, drawn instead to sleeker, faster, more modern aircraft. A guide described it as outdated but historically significant. Reed smiled faintly. Outdated machines vanish. This one had endured. He thought back to that humid airstrip, the jungle pressing in. The moment he first realized that the MiG was not a mistake of engineering, but a deliberate answer to a brutal question. What still works when everything goes wrong? In his final notes, never officially published, Reed wrote, Vietnam taught us that war does not reward elegance. It rewards alignment. The enemy aligned their machines with the reality of conflict. We aligned ours with our expectations. When those expectations failed, their machines remained relevant longer than ours. Decades later, some of those ideas resurfaced. Aircraft emphasizing maintainability, simplicity, survivability, designs that assumed damage, fatigue, and imperfect conditions. The lesson had not been lost, only delayed. Reed lived out his retirement quietly, far from airbases and briefing rooms. When asked in a rare interview what Vietnam had taught him, he answered without hesitation. That the most dangerous enemy is not inferior technology, he said. It's technology that assumes the world will behave. He paused, looking toward the horizon. The MiG-17 didn't care what the world was supposed to be. It was built for what the world actually was. And that, Reed believed, was why it mattered. Not because it was the best aircraft of the war, but because it understood the war better than anyone expected. In the long conflict between perfection and persistence, Vietnam had chosen persistence. And persistence, once again, had endured.